Welcome back, Beth, and thank you so much for joining us. And I'm going to put myself on mute.
All right. Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be back. So just as a footnote to my initial presentation, I'd like to address a concern that was expressed by a participant with regards to the lack of what she felt was balance in the presentation as it pertained to the risks of the use of intermittent fasting, particularly referencing those suffering from disordered eating behaviors like anorexia, bulimia, or a combination of both. If you remember, I briefly referenced the populations for whom intermittent fasting wouldn't be appropriate, including those with certain medical conditions and or disordered eating towards the end of the webinar. And I'd like to say, as the mother of 3 adult daughters who I've tried to raise well in this toxic food environment, I am hypersensitive to the messaging that they have received growing up and would never, of course, intentionally make light of the seriousness of the condition and all of our battles with self-acceptance. I've been fighting that battle through education on behalf of them and behalf of my population at large for as long as I've been practicing. And I would have to agree that it wasn't exactly a balanced presentation of the risks and benefits of intermittent fasting, but rather a look at its history through our evolution and really focusing on the potential health benefits. And I appreciate that while it is a practice that's been part of our evolution and holds great promise, in my opinion, it, like every other health message, also has to be compassionately considered in the context of the society that we live in today. So I am grateful for the thoughtful email that was sent, and I do strive to be mindful of the broad range of interests in my audiences. So without further ado, let's jump in. And I will also say that there are way few less slides. I do get a little overambitious. So there's fewer slides in this presentation. I'm going to do a little overview of what we covered last time, but then would really love to focus on more of the Q&As and discussion at the end, just to give everybody a chance to participate. So again, same disclaimer, the information in the webinar is not meant to diagnose or treat any medical condition. It's meant for educational purposes only, and you are always recommended to consult with practitioners involved in your care before making any lifestyle changes. Okay, so this is the agenda or overview. So again, I'm just going to make some quick notes about part 1. Review some of the categories of fasts and best practices, explain a little bit of what happens during a fast, explain the difference between clean and quote-unquote dirty fasting, discuss some of the potential side effects, and again, just review who fasting is not safe for, and then just kind of bottom lining it and moving on to some fasting Q&As. Okay, so again, fasting is choosing to abstain from eating for personal, religious, or health reasons. You choose when to stop and you choose when to start eating. There's no defined starting or end points. It's simply the absence of eating. And we've been doing it for a millennium. It's simple and it's ambiguous. And most importantly, it's not a diet, but rather it's a lifestyle choice. It's a state of being, and it suggests not what to eat, but rather when to eat. The other point there is that it isn't starvation, which is not voluntary. It's not deliberate and not controlled. And it's been happening like as long as we've been on the earth, in times of war, in times of famine, in times of food scarcity. You also have to consider that whenever any of our pets or mammals in general are ill, they avoid eating. Even if we lose our appetite when we're sick, we tend to stop eating, and that's part of self-preservation. If we consider the summary, and again, I'll go over these quickly. Just improved mental clarity. It induces weight loss, lowers blood sugar, increases energy. All of the things that are on the summary slide is really a result of the metabolic shift that happens as we step into what's termed metabolic flexibility. as we stop as our carb intake decreases and we start transitioning to a lower carb, higher fat, higher protein diet, we also shift our sources of energy in the body. And with that shift comes a shift in hormones and nutrient signaling, which results in all of these improved metabolic functions. So this is, and you are free to disagree with me, but in terms of the summary of the myths of fasting, it's my professional and clinical assessment that this couple looks actually pretty healthy. It's important to keep in mind in terms of busting those myths that metabolism actually increases during fasting. If you think about it, it makes sense from a survival standpoint. If we don't eat, our body uses stored energy so it can go on to find other foods and move around. In order to do that, the hormones switch to allow that metabolic flexibility to mobilize stored body fat. And as we're making that shift, our hormones and the catecholamines also increase to kind of prepare our body for that fight, flight, or feed, which is the sympathetic drive. And all of that shifting actually happens at an increase of 117% while our body's in the fasting state. So the human body evolved to sustain periods of fasting. Muscle is preserved as long as we have the fat to burn. And actually our bodies have to reach about 4% body fat before it resorts to burning muscle tissue. And in fact, fasting is one of the most potent stimuli for growth hormone, and increased growth hormone helps to maintain this lean body mass. And in addition, when we think about how our body builds muscle, certainly it's a function of eating protein, but it's also lost or gained as a function of the exercise that we get day in and day out. In terms of blood sugar levels, those are, again, because they're very hormone related, they're tightly regulated by the body, and there's multiple mechanisms to keep that in place. Appetites actually decrease as fasting increases, again, due to the regulation of hunger hormones and the decrease in insulin. Nutrients, they're actually conserved during fasting. Proteins and fats are actually recycled as the body's demands increase and decrease. And the effectiveness for managing obesity and the comorbidities associated is really unquestioned. Okay, so if we consider, now we're just going to take a look at what happens when we eat. And, this is a slide of what happens in the first 0 to 3 hours. When we eat, the goal is really to digest and assimilate the breakdown products of the carbohydrates, the proteins, and the fats that we eat. And what we don't need immediately for energy, our body stores as body fat. The hormones, as we mentioned, that's involved both in the storage and the use of food energy is insulin. And insulin rises during the meals. It rises both in response to carbohydrates and in response to proteins, which many people are surprised to know. Fats also increase insulin secretion, but to a minimal extent. And again, our bodies store the excess glucose as glycogen in muscle and liver. And as I mentioned in part 1, it's estimated that we have about 2,000 calories in stored glucose or glycogen in the muscle and in the liver. So then what happens if we exceed that storage capacity? Well, that's when the glucose is then stored as fat. And we as mammals actually bear witness to the fact that the body can store almost infinite amounts of body fat. If glucose is then needed and we burn through those 2,000 calories worth of stored glycogen, then excess protein, which is broken down into amino acids, can also be converted into glucose if it's needed. So between those hours of 0 and 3, the body's still going through the process of digesting, ingesting, absorbing, and digesting everything that you ate in the meal. And then after your body breaks them down into the constituents, it's stored and mobilized when it's needed. There's fluctuations in hunger hormones, the leptin and the ghrelin. Ghrelin is actually the hunger hormone that turns on turns on your appetite, and leptin is actually the satiety hormone, which does just the opposite. So after a meal, your ghrelin levels fall, your leptin levels rise, and effectively your appetite turns off, signaling the brain that you're pretty much full. So in the 0 to 24 hours, this is when the body is, again, starting to deplete carbohydrate stores and is slowly switching to burning fat stores for energy. If you think about those stores as a refrigerator, so the refrigerator is no longer full, the body needs to tap into the freezer stores. If we think of the body fat as a freezer, the refrigerated stores are more accessible, the freezer is less accessible, so we have to move through the food in the freezer, liver and muscle, and then move into the freezer stores, which are our body fat. So during this 4 to 24 hour phase, the body switches to a catabolic or a breakdown state where nutrients are stored and put to use. Blood glucose levels are dropping, insulin levels are dropping. There's actually an increase in a hormone called glucagon, which stimulates the breakdown of glycogen, again, that stored glucose that's in the liver, as an optional energy source. And since glucose is still our body's main fuel source in this phase, the metabolism attempts to break down enough glycogen just to keep your blood glucose in that normal range, which we think of as between like 70 and 120 milligrams per deciliter. Towards the end of this phase, you're going to start depleting your glycogen stores, which means you need to access another fuel source. That's when your body begins to switch from burning glucose as an energy source to burning body fat and converting the body fat into ketones in the liver. So again, glucose is still primary, but you're going to begin to transition into using fat stores and ketone bodies to kind of make up the difference when the glycogen stores deplete. And so the next two slides just kind of are examples of the two different states that the body is in particular while you're fasting. So during a fast, your body can either be in a fed or a fasted state. In the fed state, that's when insulin is high and the body's in storage mode. But remember when in part one, we talked about the fact that insulin is not just a hormone that helps to move glucose from the blood into the tissues. Again, perhaps either to use it or to store it in muscle and liver, but it's also a fat storage hormone. So as insulin increases, blood sugar levels decrease, but it makes it impossible for our body to tap into the stored body fat. So in the fasted state, when insulin is low and the body burns energy stores, intermittent fasting makes the body burn fat in the absence of glucose. So spending time in that fasted state is kind of a form of exercise. We refer to it as a metabolic workout. It's kind of training our body to move from being a carb burner, glycogen, glucose, muscle and liver glycogen, glucose, into being a fat burner. And when we extend that time in the fasted state, it actually improves our ability to burn fat efficiently and quickly. Now, it's important to keep in mind that it actually takes about 12 hours after the last meal that we've eaten to reach that fasted state. So this is where we'll talk about the different types of fasting, whether it's 16-8 or 24 or 18-6. This is just another graphic that kind of explains the same thing, but perhaps in a little easier to read form. We improve our fat adaptation over time as we lower our carbohydrate intake, as we use up our glycogen stores and move from that fed to that fasted state. And then depending upon how long we're in that fasted state, we're actually kind of flexing that metabolic muscle that helps us improve our fat adaptation. All right, this was a slide that we also saw on part one, and I just included it again because it really shines the light on the many roles of insulin and the many kind of metabolic effects or the impact that elevated levels of insulin and blood sugar have throughout the body. And this is, I guess, this is just a good example of the power of intermittent fasting, lower carbohydrate diets. We're not really talking about a ketogenic diet here, but just by lowering our carbohydrate intake to about 100 grams a day, it helps us lower insulin levels, and it impacts every one of these body pathways. So as we also reviewed in part 1, these are just some of the chronic illnesses that we see with increased insulin levels over time. And with an increased insulin level, again, over time, our body begins to loses its sensitivity to insulin, that being insulin resistance. So by lowering insulin levels gradually over time, we continue to improve that insulin sensitivity. The body becomes more responsive to insulin, and we can actually mitigate / avoid some of these, otherwise chronic illnesses that, as a result of the Western diet, we are probably due to face at one point or another. So fasting in combination with that low carbohydrate diet is probably the most consistent and quickest way to decrease insulin levels. The other way to do that, and I don't know if I mentioned this later on, but just in case. So it is about low carbohydrate. It is about fasting to use up whatever glucose is floating around and perhaps some of the stored muscle and liver glycogen, and in combination with regular exercise. So when we exercise, we're also tapping into the glucose that might be in circulation. And when we're done burning through that, then we're going to be tapping into the muscle glycogen, the liver glycogen. And as we have that combination of low carbohydrate over time and regular exercise over time, we're going to deplete that estimated 2,000 calories worth of stored glycogen. And it's at that point that we really begin to flex that metabolic muscle and tap into our body's infinite fat stores. And again, the number that was so sobering in part 1 is that, and the numbers are kind of all over the place, but probably the minimum that any of us have at any point in time is about 40,000 calories worth of stored energy in the form of body fat. So it behooves us to take advantage of that, especially if we're trying to manage weight, manage blood sugar levels, manage insulin levels, etc. Okay, so this is a slide, and I have a few of these. This is where we're kind of taking a look at more of what happens when we eat and what's happening in terms of those hormone shifts. So on the y-axis here, we see the blood glucose levels, and on the x-axis, we see the time after eating. If we, here we have the curve of the normal blood sugar level. But as we eat and blood sugar levels increase, glucose spike, eating at a high amount of digestible carbohydrates leads to a large glucose spike. The pancreas senses this increase in glucose. It puts out and often oversecretes the hormone insulin, which causes blood sugar levels to spike, to drop. And with this, we actually have again, insulin will block the breakdown of glucose, and it will stimulate fat storage. So minimal fat burning during this phase of eating. This is an example, or a really nicely simplified slide of what happens. We grew up in a time, or really, I think the message has changed as we were growing up. Instead of, in the 1950s, we were probably eating 3 meals a day. We were probably not eating snacks. That began to change in the 60s, the 70s, and 80s, and the whole snack industry pretty much exploded. So many of the clients that I see currently like it's enough to have to plan breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but then they're also wanting to plan snacks. And if we kind of maintain that small, frequent meals throughout the day, which again, we were told stabilizes mood, energy levels, blood sugar levels, none of it based in good hard science, by the way. But what also happens is that if we're continuously eating and we're not giving our pancreas or our liver a break, the insulin levels are going to remain elevated, and we're never going to get that decrease in fasting insulin levels, much less the decrease in fasting glucose levels. So what does that mean? Even if they're small, frequent meals, it's still stimulating the pancreas to release insulin, and we're still going to be in fat storage mode. Okay, and this is another graph of that, the fed and the fasted states. So typically, the fed state starts when you begin eating. And again, we saw the next 3 to 5 hours, our body's digesting, it's absorbing, it's assimilating. Insulin rises significantly, completely shutting off fat burning and triggering any excess calories to be stored as fat. After the first few hours, our body goes into what's known as that post-absorptive state. The components of the meal are still in circulation, and that actually takes like 8 to 12 hours after your last meal before you really enter the fasted state. And that's also important when we're considering, if we want to do intermittent fasting, what is our plan going to look like? So when you finally get to that fasted state, that's when your body can burn fat that's been inaccessible during the fed state. This is one reason why many people who start intermittent fasting will lose fat without changing what they eat or how much they eat or how often they exercise, because it's not again necessarily what you're eating. And certainly, we would want to be eating a healthy diet, but rather it's when. Are you giving, regardless of the number of calories, are you giving your body the opportunity to step into that fasted state so you can mobilize excess stored body fat? And if we're eating 6 small meals a day, or if we're eating 3 meals a day that are too close together, and we don't really get to that post-absorptive state where our blood sugar drops and insulin levels drop, then it's going to be very difficult to actually maintain that metabolic flexibility. And this is another way of looking at it. This actually is a great graphic of what looks like a true metabolic workout. This is when we're in a lower insulin state and a higher insulin state. If we eat meals that are high in carbohydrates, we get a spike in insulin. If we eat carbohydrates with protein and fat, we also get a spike in insulin. If we just eat protein, there's a more moderate rise in insulin. And again, fat has a minimal impact on insulin, but there is a little bit of a blip. And all of this decreases, again, obviously, if we're managing carbohydrates, if we're not eating quite so many calories, if we consolidate these meals and have more time in this fasted state, that's when we begin to tap into and exercise that metabolic flexibility. This is an example of what happens if we're eating just 3 meals a day. Insulin stimulated fat formation. So we eat breakfast, but then we have this break. So this is obviously without snacking. So our body has an opportunity to kind of dip in a little bit to the decrease in insulin. But then the next meal that we eat, we're going to have that rise in insulin. But then if we leave between 3 and 5 hours in between meals, we can also begin to dip into that reduced insulin state. And here we have what happens overnight. Again, if we leave at least 8 hours overnight sleeping, our body, again, has an opportunity to kind of dip into that fasting state. And I'd say this is more likely and more easily to happen if we are eating a low carbohydrate diet, kind of moving through our glycogen stores, we're more easily able to kind of dip into these low insulin states. So I talked about metabolic flexibility. That's just the ability of the body to transition from burning carbohydrates to burning body fat. And again, for those of us who grew up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was all about low fat, it was high carb, we ate small frequent meals, all of our cracker and chippy things were refined flours and carbohydrate based. And as a result, we were carb burners, but making that transition helps us to stabilize insulin levels, stabilize blood sugar, stabilize mood, and stabilize energy. This is just another way of looking at our glycogen stores versus, so burning glucose versus burning body fat. Before I mentioned the refrigerator and freezer analogy. So this is kind of the same thing. If we have a hybrid car, we can burn both gasoline and we can also use the battery. It can be electric and gas powered. So we have that hybrid model. That would be metabolic flexibility if that were the body. But if we're just burning gasoline, if we run out of gas, we run out of gas, as opposed to having the option of tapping into both body fat and glucose. And again, just the refrigerator freezer, it takes a lot more effort to get into the freezer foods, especially if we have a chest freezer in the basement. So we need to move through all of the fresh food, which would be the glucose and the high carb diet, before we can even tap into that energy that's stored as body fat. So if we take a look at the kinds of fast and best practices, these are kind of the most popular methods of intermittent fasting. And in looking at these numbers, the first number refers to the amount of hours fasting versus the amount of hours in the feeding mode. So 16-8 would be an example of a 16-hour overnight fast, probably skipping breakfast, so that maybe you're eating between 12 and 8, but you're leaving a 16-hour overnight fasting window. That's a very popular method. 24 is also referred to as maybe one meal a day. So you could either eat breakfast and then fast for the rest of the day and overnight, or if you're not hungry in the morning, you might skip breakfast and lunch and then just maybe eat an early dinner and then fast overnight. So you're eating within a 4-hour window, and then you're fasting in a 20-hour window. The 5-2, now this one's a little different. This would be eating normally for 5 days a week, but on 2 days of non-consecutive days, so maybe you choose Monday and Wednesday, you're only going to drop your calorie intake by about 500 calories a day. And that has a similar effect of kind of strengthening that metabolic flexibility. Other extended fasts include the 24-hour fast, the 36-hour fast. You can also look at the 16-8, the 18-6, which isn't listed here, but that's just kind of the reverse of the 16-8. It would be fasting for 18 hours and eating within a 6-hour window. Those are all, you could also refer to them as time-restricted feeding. And when you talk about fasting, it's often an extended fast, like 24, 36, 48 hours and beyond. Those are pretty ambitious. Again, just another look at the traditional approach, 6 meals a day, what that does in terms of our insulin levels, our high carbohydrate levels. We are rarely in that metabolically flexed mode of tapping into our fat stores. And what we see, so, you know, I don't know if this is, if you can see this part of the slide. But again, this is just how many of us grew up eating. It's very hard to get into that metabolic flexibility. It often interferes with our sleep. And this is, again, kind of another look at the other 3 meals a day, getting into that fat burning mode overnight and in between meals. Again, these are like 4 to 5 hours apart with what would be a 12 to 14 hour overnight fast. So maybe an early dinner and no food after that. and then perhaps moving from this maybe to, doing a 2 meal a day. This might be skipping breakfast. This could also be skipping dinner. Again, I think it depends on, one thing that I'm always asking my clients is if they're hungry when they wake up in the morning. If you're not hungry, you don't have to eat. But if you're hungry and you just love breakfast and you're ready to go, then I say eat breakfast and, just adapt your fasting window to what you know to be true about yourself and your lifestyle. So this is just another graphic depiction of that. This would be your 8-hour eating window, maybe from 12 to 8, and then do the 16-hour fast overnight, or you can adjust it, again, as your lifestyle would prefer. This again is just another graphic depiction of the 20-hour overnight fast, eating a single meal during the day and keeping it within a 4-hour window. This could be like 4 in the afternoon to 8 p.m. at night, or it could be 10 to 2. Again, the timing is flexible. The main point of all of the fasting regimens is that it allows the body to sustain lower levels of insulin for an extended period of time. It seems very foreign to us today because we've had messages that have been drilled into our head, but truly you can put your body in a fasted state if you just give it a little time to breathe in between meals. So one way to, or these are just some suggestions on how to ease into doing and some type of time restricted feeding. I think the easiest way to step into it would be first just to eliminate snacking. Just do 3 meals a day. Stick to whole foods, reduced packaged, processed, and refined foods, in part because they're going to elevate serum insulin levels. You could start with a 12-hour fast, which again, in the 1950s, that's just what we did. We kind of ate from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. The food industry really pushed those small, frequent meals. They really pushed that increase in snacking. Begin to decrease carbohydrates to less than 100 grams a day and liberalize your fat intake for satiety and so that you're not hungry. I think the average American eats probably between 300 and 350 grams of carbohydrate a day. So I have people start where you are. Try and get an estimate of how many carbohydrates you like and set your first goal. If you're at 350, then maybe go to 300 or 250. From 250, go to 200. Until you can get down to 100 grams a day or less and see how you feel there. And if you still feel that you can make some cuts, if you can stay between 50 and 100 grams maybe. And then finally, just to kind of close the eating window so that you can extend your time in that fasting state. Okay, and just a fun fact, after a 4-day fast, which I don't know many people that do that, but your resting energy expenditure actually increases by 12%. And the only reason that I put that slide in there was just to kind of drive home the point that fasting does not decrease your resting metabolic rate. Because of the shift in the hormones, it actually increases. So we talked, or I mentioned in the agenda that we would talk about what is a clean fast. So typically when you're fasting, what you're drinking in between meals or until your first meal is basically water, black coffee, any plain tea, black tea, green tea, unflavored mineral water, unflavored sparkling water, unflavored seltzer, and some people benefit from doing a little salt or electrolytes in the water. What is not a clean fast, and these are things that, a clean fast is one that doesn't stimulate insulin, it doesn't add any calories, so there's no metabolic changes or metabolic stimuli that are coming into the diet. What is not a clean fast would be like your bulletproof coffees, your flavored coffees, diet sodas. Again, if we think of, we're not eating calories, we're eating information. If we have a diet soda, our tongue, there's even taste sensors in the GI tract, they're perceiving something sweet coming down the pike. And as such, they're going to stimulate the pancreas to release insulin. And again, insulin is that hormone that we really need to keep at a low level to stay in that fasted, metabolically flexed state. So all of the things that are listed under the no are those that either have calories or will stimulate an insulin release. The gray area are things that people often add just to kind of get through the morning or get through the evening. They're going to have minimal impact, and honestly, if it takes a little bit of something to keep you in the fasted mode, then I'd say go for it. Some of the side effects, or when you're the period of adjustment, some of the things that you want to be aware of is just generally not feeling well, increased fatigue, dizziness, being nauseated, if you have extreme hunger, if you have brain fog, then you want to pull back a little bit. You want to consider maybe going a little slower in that adaptation to a low carbohydrate diet, and maybe you want to do shorter fasting regimens. Again, this is not a race. It's kind of a lifestyle shift. So if you need to go low and slow, as most of us do because of how we grew up eating, then that is perfectly acceptable and actually preferable. This is just a review again of some of the issues to consider prior to fasting. If anybody has any, depending upon the significance of the medical history, if there's any medications, if, obviously if somebody is underweight, overweight, or struggled with disordered eating, pregnancy, breastfeeding, anemia, blood pressure, issues with blood sugar regulation, or if you develop any weakness or fatigue that doesn't stop. Again, there's no harm in jumping out of a fast and just feeding your body as you feel appropriate. And finally, this was just an interesting quote by Marie Antoinette, which just kind of brings home the point that fasting is nothing new. What's new is how we were messaged growing up in terms of the 4 food groups, the food pyramid, and all of those messages that just didn't ring true in terms of the actual science pertaining to the body. We've been fasting forever. It's used by all mammals, and it's just a matter of kind of building that metabolic flexibility that gets us back into the state of being able to tap into our body's infinite stores of body fat / energy. So the bottom line, fasting is an opportunity to really redefine our relationship with food and redirect your health trajectory in terms of minimizing our risk of those chronic illnesses that are associated with high blood sugar levels, high insulin levels, hormone dysregulation. But I use the expression, it's only health food if you eat it. So it's only a tool if it works for you and you feel better kind of using intermittent fasting. And it's important to keep it flexible and have it work into your schedule and your lifestyle if it's going to be a change that's really going to be sustainable. Okay, so with that, we can move into some of the Q&A. Hello, Dara.
Hi, Beth. Okay, cool. Can we see you now?
All right.
And maybe you could stop sharing your screen if you want. So we have so many amazing questions. We will obviously not get to all of them, but I'm trying to lump them together. And I just want to start by saying thank you. You definitely clarified a lot of questions that people had just as you went on with your presentation. And what I really appreciate about your approach, and a reason that I have sent so many patients to you, is that you also see food as part of life, right? You are first and foremost a human being with a family and realistic approach to food that should be fun and wonderful and enjoyable, as well as not making you unhealthy. So I just want to say thank you for that.
Thank you.
We have a lot of patients in the audience who might have other medical issues, for example, diabetes, and older patients. So I wonder, a lot of diabetics have been told to eat frequent small meals throughout the day and not to fast, and that their blood sugar would get too low because they're taking either insulin or medicines that drop their blood sugar. Do you think this is something that can safely be done for people with diabetes?
I think it can absolutely, unequivocally be safely done with somebody who's a type 2 diabetic. Type 1 diabetics, that's another conversation, but type 2 diabetes, it can absolutely be done safely and slowly with the help of a physician who's on board. My brother-in-law is actually type 2 diabetic and was on ginormous amounts of insulin. And so Jason Fung, who I'm a huge fan of, and just FYI, I do have a list of like my favorite podcasts, some scholarly articles that people I think would really be interested in reading. But Jason Fung actually has a little video clip that you can send to your endocrinologist or PCP to help them understand where you're coming from. What we know is that insulin is actually the problem, as we saw in part 1 and part 2 of this talk. Insulin doesn't cure diabetes. Insulin just masks elevated blood sugar. It puts blood sugar into our tissues. So it's not really going away. It's not helping the disease. It's just treating the symptom. Low blood sugar doesn't mean that you're metabolically well. But I think it's a mind shift, and it's a shift in our treatment modalities that we've been doing for decades. So it's big, but you do need to get the buy-in of your physician. It's like trying to wean off a proton pump inhibitor. You need the buy-in of the physician that put you on that in the first place. But what we know is that insulin is the problem. And by giving somebody more insulin, they're just going to gain weight because they're going to be in that fed state perpetually.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting that when people have low blood sugar, it's not generally because they failed to eat. It might be because they ate the wrong thing, and maybe they had a meal that was very high in carbs and their blood sugar went high, but then when the insulin goes high as a response, it bottoms out the blood sugar. So those roller coasters of blood sugar, I think, is what we're getting at, or something to avoid. Exactly.
And the way to avoid them is to step into a little lower carb intake. I mean, again, we were saying eat 60% carbohydrate and then dividing up protein and fat. And that's not a way to sustain an anti-inflammatory environment in our body. That's just creating that, those glucose spikes and the insulin spikes throughout the day. And we just keep eating to that insulin level, or else we're going to feel dizzy and nauseated and have low blood sugar. We need to tap into our body fat stores.
Yes.
To reach that.
So I want to get back to the carbohydrates. There's a few questions about digestible versus non-digestible, refined versus unrefined.
Yeah.
Isn't it good to have unrefined carbs? Can you speak a little more about that?
Yes. So the refined carbs, if you imagine going from I think I like using oats as the best example. Going from a steel cut oat and going as opposed to quick cooking oats. Steel cut oats are less refined, or oat groats are a less refined grain. There's more fiber that's there. It takes much longer for the body to kind of break through all that, digest, absorb, and assimilate, as opposed to oat flour, for example, which is basically, you're grinding up that oat, you're increasing the surface area, you eat it, and it's essentially like eating sugar because it's digested so very quickly. And as a result, your blood sugar, your insulin level is going to be elevated because your blood sugar level is going to elevate very quickly. So the more whole food, unprocessed we can eat, like less refined oats or whole grains, but whole fruits, whole vegetables, with the skin, with the seed intact, very less processed, more from the ground, the slower it takes our body to digest it. So the slower the rise in blood sugar, the slower the rise in insulin. And there's actually an opportunity there. If you say, for example, walk after dinner or walk after one of those meals, you're going to be exercising and utilizing that glucose that is in post-absorptive state.
So interesting. So like, for example, Cheerios, which advertise on the box whole grain.
Yeah.
An example of a very finely ground whole grain that doesn't.
Super refined. You take a Cheerio and rub it between your fingers and it's poof, it's gone. And as quickly it's digested, absorbed, and assimilated and impacting our blood sugar.
So a better choice would be the steel cut oats or whole grain oats.
Whole grains, or a little scrambled egg with avocado and black beans and salsa. I mean, that's
because oats are carbohydrates. So carbs are better. Whole grain carbs are better than refined carbs, but even better yet would be a smaller amount of carbs with a larger amount of a healthy fat, healthy protein.
Absolutely, absolutely. We need very, very minimal carbs to exist, to sustain. But again, it's so hard to undo what we've learned and what we've been practicing, some of us for quite a few decades.
So what did you have for breakfast today, Beth?
So I actually do either an 18-6 or a 16-8. So I'm never hungry. I've never been hungry when I woke up in the morning, but I always ate breakfast because I was told to eat breakfast. I had to break my fast. I was going to ruin my metabolism, but I was never hungry, so I never felt well eating. So doing that skipping breakfast comes very easily to me. Regrettably, I love breakfast foods. So it's not unheard of for me to be doing scrambled eggs and avocado and black beans and salsa at 2 in the afternoon, if that's when I break my fast.
That sounds amazing.
And I just keep, I mean, if you're doing that, just keep busy. Maybe exercise in the morning, or, go through your emails, or clean the house, or, do your errands. Just keeping busy is real. Keeping busy, keeping hydrated, and knowing what you're going to eat when you break your fast is really important. And also the quality of the meal that you eat to break your fast is really important. If we only have 1 or 2 opportunities a day to eat, then we need to make the most of that meal and really nourish our body in that short feeding window.
Yes, it's so important, because I think the early studies showed that you could still eat the same amount of food and calories and junk food, just eat it in a small window. And that
Exactly.
is true, but better yet is to eat nutrient-rich, healthy foods that are low in refined carbs when you do.
Exactly. There are people that will get benefit just by increasing their fasting window, but eating the same diet that they ate before. I don't recommend that. I just like to kind of raise the bar on all of that, but that's just how powerful that fasting window is. And again, you can start with 12 hours overnight, like what we used to do. You will still get benefit just by doing a 12-hour overnight fast and not snacking in between meals. So eating sufficient amounts of food at breakfast, at lunch, at dinner. Same benefits. You get more benefits if you extend the fast. It depends upon what your goals are. If you are metabolically compromised a bit, like you're type 2 diabetic, you would benefit from a longer fasting window. But if you are metabolically healthy, you get significant benefits from that 12 to 12 overnight fast. If you're looking for the longevity, and we talked about autophagy in part 1, if you're really looking for those longevity pieces, doing extended fasts, 24, maybe 36 hours, or working up to them, importantly, is really where we tap into the body's ability to get rid of the dead, dying proteins, to increase stem cell production. It's pretty amazing. But we get benefits from 12 hours, from 14-hour fasts, from 16, 18. It's still there.
And I like that the graph you showed if you exercise on top of it, you get to that fasting state sooner, right?
Exactly. Just burn through the glycogen.
Yeah.
Burn through the glycogen and make sure that you eat enough fat and protein so that you're not hungry, so that you're satiated. But in reality, what happens when we're in that fasted mode is that our hormones totally shift. You don't get hungry. After you burn through the glycogen, you don't have the hunger because your hormones have shifted. You're out of that sympathetic fight or flee. The cortisol levels, which increase because your body thinks like, where's my fuel, are actually lessened. So, you hit that 36-hour if you're doing it an extended fast, or again, no matter how you get there, if you gradually reduce carbs, you're still going to get there. But it's a really powerful way to establish a new relationship with the food that you eat. No longer has that control. Carbohydrates are what kind of drive us crazy and make us feel like we're famished and we have to eat, when the reality is, no, I have about 40,000 calories in there. That has to be something else, and that's the fluctuations in hormones. It's not that we're starving, that's hormonal.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You talked a little bit about intuitive eating, and I've had a bunch of patients who saw your first session and tried the intermittent fasting. And for you, skipping breakfast seems to come naturally. For a lot of people, I think skipping the after dinner snacking in front of the television is an easier thing to get rid of, because that's also more evolutionarily, like, sun goes down, kitchen's closed, chill out, go to bed. Don't stay up eating a bag of chips in front of the television for 4 more hours. So I guess intuitive eating would also can go hand in hand with this intermittent fasting for a lot of people like you who said, I never wanted to eat breakfast. I forced myself because I thought I was supposed to. Those are probably the people who are going to find it easier to skip breakfast and eat later in the day.
Absolutely.
There's people who wake up hungry, kind of ready to go, and might eat their biggest meal in the morning.
Which is brilliant, by the way. I mean, that's a brilliant, that's just a brilliant way to proceed. It blows my mind when I have clients who, they stop eating at 5 and they eat nothing because we're so attuned to having that after dinner dessert or snack in front of the TV. Those habits are hardwired and difficult to break. So my hat's off to people who can do that. That's no small task.
Yeah, no, and I think your advice to stay busy is really important, because if your habit is to sit in front of the TV and this is just what you're used to, it's really hard. And it takes what I think science shows 28 days to make a new habit or something like that. To find something else to do besides perhaps what you had associated with the munching could be good, like maybe clean your house at night or read a book instead of watching TV. Because it comes with the advertisements that anybody watching TV is going to get hungry because it's really
of course. I mean, it's been the food industry that's been lobbying and actually making the rules. They've been making the rules since the 1950s. So it's time we kind of take that back.
Yes, they're manipulating us.
Yeah, very much so.
Couple questions here about alcohol and intermittent fasting. How does that play a role?
So, okay, so alcohol would not be considered congruent with fasting. So if you're fasting, and it really would be those 4 or 5 beverages that don't have any metabolic effect. Alcohol will break a fast, if that's the question. It will wake the liver up like nobody's business.
A simple carbohydrate, right? It's the simplest of all carbohydrates.
And it has calories.
Yeah, a lot.
So just that will break the fast.
How to avoid the heartburn that happens sometimes when you're fasting?
Interesting.
I think for some people, eating, especially carbs, settles the stomach. And so I think they find when they don't eat, maybe the acid isn't neutralized.
So I actually go back to from a functional medicine perspective, what's the root cause of the acid reflux? Is it a lack in the lower esophageal sphincter pressure? And what's that about? It's more likely that they don't make sufficient stomach acid to close that sphincter. And what might work is actually doing some, like taking some, how would you do it? Taking some chia seeds or fiber, perhaps. That also helps with feeling full. So you'll have, something in the belly, but it won't be sufficient to break your fast.
Interesting.
But if it was something more physiological, maybe I would then do aloe vera juice or like a slippery elm tea or, but I think it goes back to root cause. Like, why would somebody be having acid reflux on an empty stomach? There has to, so it would be getting to the bottom of that.
Okay.
And again, or is it just weight? If there's an increase in pressure on the diaphragm because we have a little too much belly fat, then that's also going to put pressure on the diaphragm and increase the likelihood to reflux stomach or bile contents.
Yeah. I suppose in the term, a little Tums would be fine.
Tums would be absolutely fine. Absolutely, yeah, good one. Absolutely fine.
Do you recommend exercising during the fasting or the fed state?
I recommend exercising during the fast state. You actually get better exercise gains. And again, if we think about that metabolic flexibility, if you eat when you're exercising, you're just burning the glucose that you're eating. You're burning the carbohydrate that you're eating. You're not getting into the glycogen stores and then getting into the mobilizing the fat. And again, you get better strength gains. You get better endurance and cardiovascular benefits if you exercise in a fasted state, because it's that stress on the body life begins outside your comfort zone. It's the stress on the body that actually makes your muscles grow and your cardiovascular system benefit.
If I could put in a plug, though, for making sure that you are hydrated, and perhaps this is the time you might have salt and electrolytes in water.
Absolutely.
Morning exercise or on an empty stomach.
Yeah, absolutely. The only caveat with the electrolytes is that it be unsweetened.
Yeah.
Right. But there are many really good electrolyte powders, or even just adding a pinch of Himalayan salt in your water bottle while you're exercising, because you will dehydrate quicker in a fasted state. So maintaining that hydration is pretty critical.
Yes.
Great point.
Otherwise, that's often when people get the headache and the dizzy and the nausea is
exactly. Yep.
Low sugar, but from low volume, low blood pressure.
Yes.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, which is, what about people who need to take medicines throughout the day with food? How do you recommend they deal with this?
Right. So if it's a medication and it has to be taken with food, then I would make sure that I could take it during my fed state. There are many supplements that can be taken on an empty stomach. There are ones that should be taken with food. So I would just time them accordingly and maybe adjust your fasting regimen. So it either, if we're skipping breakfast, if we're keeping breakfast, maybe depending upon your medication schedule, I would do it that way. And just be mindful of some of those supplements. We're very fond of the gummy vitamin Ds and the gummy adult vitamins, and those will break a fast. Protein powders will break a fast. If there's any, again, artificial sweetener it'll break a fast. So there are many supplements you can take on an empty stomach. The ones that you would need to take with food, like the fat soluble A, D, E, and K, I would take with my meal. But I've taken fish oil and turmeric and vitamin D and vitamin K on an empty stomach. The one and I've tried taking a multivitamin on an empty stomach. That doesn't always work very well. So I'll take it when I'll take it when I'm shifting my fasting window.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Now, before we wrap up, there's a lot of people who are looking to see how they could get more information or even talk with you. So unfortunately for all of you, Beth is not taking new patients because she's really, really, really backed up. Is that still true, Beth?
Well, so if people are persistent and patient, I will take them. I am booking the third week in October, barring cancellations. But if you're patient and persistent in terms of like checking in to see if I have any cancellations, then I welcome anybody. I have there is no one that I would turn away. It's just that I am a little busy.
A little busy. Okay, so what we're going to do after today, so for all of you to know, this has been recorded and Sydney is going to post it on our website probably by Friday, certainly by Monday. There are a lot of questions we didn't get to. I apologize. A lot of them are, they're all excellent questions. Beth may be able to answer a few of them. We'll shoot them to you, Beth. And what we'll do is we'll send out, when we send the survey for you to fill out about today's session, we will also send Beth's list of references. So you have some books, some podcasts that you'd recommend people to. A lot of people could do this on their own. Ideally, I think for all of us, but especially those who have medical issues or diabetes or other concerns, it's best to do it with a professional guiding you.
Yeah.
But for young, healthy people, if you want to read a book and hear a podcast and try it on your own, that's probably okay.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend Jason Fung's Ultimate Guide to Fasting, the Obesity.
Oops. Okay, I think we've lost Beth. Okay, for those of you who are still here, looks like we've lost the audio. We're going to send the name of the book. It's Jason Fung's Ultimate Guide to Fasting, but there's a whole list of references and resources that Beth has. So I want to thank all of you for joining today. This was a wonderful session, and so keep your eyes on your email. And thank you, Beth. Yeah. Lost Beth.
We have 2 pre-op.
Okay. Thanks very much.